Thank you. As people trickle in, I'm going to get started so we can get through all the great material we have today. Good morning and welcome to OHDSI 2019. Thank you all for coming today. The registration is free, but your time is not, and donating your time to OHDSI, both the symposium today and in the course of the year, all the work that people did is very much appreciated. Today we're going to talk about evaluation. How do we know we're making progress on our journey? And I'm going to go into more detail. But before I do that, I want to thank our sponsors. As you know, we remain registration free, which allows us to invite a lot of people who couldn't come otherwise. And it just highlights our open community. I want to thank Janssen, Case Western, Google, Bayer, IQVIA, and Odysseus. And I want to thank the FDA for their generous support through an FDA Scientific Conference grant program through CBER. And I'll talk more about our relationship there in a moment. And I want to thank those of you who contributed for contributions from viewers like you who opted to pay the optional registration fee, and that's also helpful. So thank you. OHDSI, for those of you who are new to OHDSI, OHDSI is an open science community. And our mission is, and I'm going to read it verbatim, to improve health by empowering a community to collaboratively generate the evidence that promotes better health decisions and better care. And this is really what we do. And I don't know how we got to this mission statement. I actually like it quite a bit. Paul Beyondich is the one who pushed us to create a mission statement like this. And it just it really encapsulates what we're trying to do so well. And we've been able to keep that, and hopefully for a long time to come. We always show our values. I won't read through this, but I'll read the values: innovation, reproducibility, community, collaboration, openness, and beneficence. Here's our community updated slide of where we are. We have 256 collaborators in 27 different countries. Here I'm defining collaborator as someone who's willing to create a biography and put a photograph on our website. Those of you who are members of the community who haven't done that yet, please do that. We have 27 countries from 6 different continents. You see we're well represented in North America, Europe, and Asia, and working on Africa, South America, and Australia. We had, as I think I may have mentioned last year, we had a brief, almost a 7th continent, but the person who agreed to do it left Antarctica, so we're still down at 6. Please remind me more of that next year. We need to be able to say 7. Let's talk a little bit about our engagement. Now, I mentioned that 256 is probably an underestimate. We have almost 3,000 people active on our forums. So it seems that we're much broader than indicated by the biographies. 18,000 posts on 3,000 topics. We have implementers, developers, researchers, etc. We have weekly community web conferences, not just weekly, but often because of the size of OHDSI, we have to have 2 calls per week to cover the 2 hemispheres. It's just too hard to capture the entire world. We actually go all the way around the circumference of the Earth. We have over 25 work groups, common data model, population level estimation, patient level prediction, and so on. We've been holding quarterly tutorials in OHDSI tools and best practices taught by OHDSI collaborators, generally in a volunteer basis. So OHDSI is an open science community with a lot of volunteer effort, and thank you for those. Most of them are in the audience for putting on those tutorials. And of course, we have our symposia in North America, Europe, and Asia on an annual basis. And we have a much stronger presence on social media now. We've always been trying to do it, but with the joining of Craig Saxon to the group, we're increasing that presence. Our community, our posts and activities on the forum continue to increase every year. Here's who's registered for the symposium today. And what you'll see in the left pie chart, you see academia, government, and then industry broken into health system, technology, pharmaceutical, and then we have patients and payers. The good news is that most of those slices, like academia, government, industry, are large slices. In other words, we're fairly broadly placed. So, in medicine, often you talk about the stool that has 3 legs, and there's a number of ways of describing it. One one of them is academia, government, and industry, and we're well placed there. And on the right, we prove that we're an interdisciplinary initiative, shown informatics, computer science, medicine, epidemiology, and so on. One surprise is at the meeting today, 240 out of about, let's see, there were 540 registrants for OHDSI Symposium, so almost half are new to OHDSI and curious to learn more. And then the other half or so are experienced in OHDSI and delineate how active they've been. But the community's been extremely active, and we collectively are very thankful for that. We have an international data network. Let me talk about that a little bit. So there are 152 entries in the OHDSI data network inventory. So just as we have 3,000 people on the forums and 250 identify themselves on the website, these are the ones who identify their database on our website. The total number of databases using the OHDSI CDM, OMOP CDM, is probably much larger. But nevertheless, in that list alone, we have 133 different databases with patient-level data. So it's mostly electronic health records and claims data, but also clinical registries, health surveys, biobanks, increasing breadth of data. We have data from 18 different countries, and if you look outside the U.S., there's 369 million patient records. Most of those are unique, and even if you just take the biggest database in each country, assuming little overlap among countries, you get at least 300 million, and then that underestimates it because a lot of those other national databases are not overlapping. Which means we probably now finally have more data from outside the U.S. than inside the U.S. So the U.S. is 320 million. We have most of those people, not every single last one. It's represented in billions of records, but there's duplication. So we're at close to, perhaps over 600 million unique patients around the world. So the world is 7 billion people. So we're getting very close to that point where we're at 10% of the world population in the OHDSI federated network, all on voluntary basis. So what we didn't do is get a big single government grant from any government in the world, and yet we've been able to achieve this, 10% of the world population almost represented in our databases. So that's pretty good. All in a common data model. I mean, it's one thing to get the world population in a set of databases around the world, but to get them using the identical vocabularies, the identical data model is quite an achievement. Here's a picture of the OHDSI OMOP Common Data Model schema. Its beauty is in its simplicity, its understandability. We do have an entity attribute value, take anything that doesn't fit anywhere else kind of table, but otherwise we try to split things out in a way that researchers new to OHDSI can look at this data model and say, okay, I get it. There are the drugs, there are the diseases, there are devices, there are procedures, and actually use the thing. And I think that's been part of our success. Creating a world database requires supporting the world's vocabularies, and we support 130 vocabularies across 40 domains. Everything from around the world mapping to a standard set, which is the meaningful use 3, SNOMED, ARCSNORM, LOINC, and a set of other vocabularies. So we're all going to a common set that are largely adopted around the world. 7 million concepts, about half of them standard and half of them mapped to those standards. And let me point out on the screen, 500,000 classification concepts. So knowledge engineering is very important in OHDSI. So creating 500,000, now that's largely imported from other vocabularies, but that's a 500,000 knowledge concepts used to organize the 7 million. So the scale is very large. We thank Odysseus and all our members who contribute to the vocabularies and keep this large thing organized with 45 million concept relationships, 74 million ancestral relationships. A lot of that we have to put in to do the mappings among the vocabularies. OHDSI is advancing science. How do we do that? First, we do methodologic research. So we're a vertically integrated thing where we go from the basic infrastructure app to actually using the thing. We do methodologic research to discover new things in analytics, in common data models, how to use vocabularies. And then we take those concepts that we've invented and turn them into real tools through open source analytics development that people can use both inside OHDSI and people use our tools outside of OHDSI also. And then we actually use it to generate evidence. And that, I think, is, there are a lot of different initiatives that have, say, a common data model, and they try to collect data, but see how much evidence is being generated. By generating evidence, you build a better data model. You build better vocabularies because you see what's really needed, because you're stuck generating the evidence. If you don't generate evidence, then it's all theoretical, and you tend to build things that don't actually meet the goals you have. Let's go through a couple of highlights of what's gone on over the last year. We've had increased adoption of the common data model, valuation of the vocabulary, expansion of the vocabulary. The Themis group working on conventions. Any of you out in standards knows that you have a standard and you have two people map their database to a common standard. They agree on almost nothing. Like, in fact, from the same institution, if you have two different people mapped to the same standard, they agree on almost nothing. So that's what the conventions are, to say, when you're given the data and given the model, how do you map from one to the other? What kind of decisions do you make? And start with the most common decisions so that we can end up actually having consistency across our very large and very diverse network. And added rigor about data quality, which you'll be hearing about in our first keynote in a little while. Here's a paper on vocabulary mapping and how that it works well in creating cohorts. I'll come back to that. A paper on chemotherapy regimen representation from the OMOP Common Data Model. Our oncology work group has been extremely active over the last 2 years. Methods research, some examples, phenotype development and phenotype evaluation and study design evaluation. Here, partnering with the eMERGE network in the U.S. to study phenotyping. Here, reducing the work of evaluating phenotypes, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But bottom line on that one is that normally it's a lot of work to evaluate a phenotype or a cohort definition because you have to manually create a gold standard. And how can we do that? By saving that work. And OHDSI reaching out of the OHDSI community to other communities, for example, pointing out the misuse of the case control design, which is useful in other contexts, but not for retrospective database studies. No use, generally no reason to use a case control study, and leads to bias and loss of power. On open source development, our big tool, Atlas, has version 2.7.3 has been released. Other tools have been developed. Criteria to Query was published. And then we have a lot of different community contributions to the utilities that use the OMOP Common Data Model. So here is the new version of Atlas shown. Here's a paper on criteria to query published in JAMIA, so the top informatics journal. And then sets of tools, this from a Tool Buttes group on using the OMOP Common Data Model. So as an open source community, letting things grow beyond the center. In clinical applications, as I said, we actually generate evidence. And last year, we spent most of our time on this evidence generation and reporting. A number of things, if you see in the box on the right, ACE inhibitors versus thiazides. Thiazides appearing to be superior. Half the world population with hypertension starts on ACE inhibitors, so maybe they shouldn't be doing that. So it's a high impact result. ACE inhibitors and ARBs, that ARBs may be superior in safety, beta blockers not being first-line agents, chlorthalidone, despite researchers' assertions, not being as good as hydrochlorothiazide, and maybe monotherapy is good. And our first very large clinical paper from this result, from the LEGEND hypertension study, has been accepted to Lancet, and we expect to see it out in the next few weeks. OHDSI's building collaborations, and let me highlight a few examples. As I mentioned, the FDA, CBER, Biologics, has its Biologics Effectiveness and Safety, or BEST initiative, and OHDSI's been working with them for several years. Shown here is a poster by the FDA and some results on the right from the first phase. We're currently in the second phase of the project and looking forward to producing good results for the FDA. The U.S. All of Us Research Program, which aims to collect 1 million participants into the All of Us Research Program. I think we're at 200,000 so far. And all the clinical data in the All of Us Research Program are encoded in the OMOP Common Data Model. That includes many of those data types I talked about earlier, not just the EHRs, not just claims, registry, Fitbit, everything going into there other than genomic data. and we're starting to have some publications coming out of it. This publication being an example of how to get your data into the OMOP data model, specifically from I2B2 to OMOP from the Harvard group. We're also collaborating with the eMERGE network, the U.S. network that joins electronic health record data in genomics. This is a picture of the network. And here's a picture of the publication on using the OMOP common data model to facilitate phenotyping in that eMERGE network, and I'm going to draw on that example later on. Next, we have the European Health Data and Evidence Network, or EDEN. EDEN is a public-private partnership to build a large-scale federated network of data sources standardized to a common data model. The vision is to be the trusted observational research ecosystem within Europe, working on harmonizing, 100 million patient records, and then in keeping with OHDSI, generating evidence based on that, and then building a community within Europe to support this. And we're very grateful that Peter Reinbeck and Erasmus taking a leadership role in this effort and pulling it forward with OHDSI and us working together. Another amazing national initiative is in Korea, the National Common Data Model Project. Thank you there to Ray Park and the Asia University. Creating a very large, we're doing a nationwide database to support research and quality improvement called the FeederNet. I'm going to go to the next slide. Here's a map. It shows it's a data network of over 60 hospitals and again 100 million patients with 70% of the tertiary hospitals in there. So what can you achieve when you have broad and both wide and deep adoption of the OMOP common data model is an amazing experiment. So thank you for that. OHDSI is a community of collaborators. I'm going to show you some examples of collaboration. I mentioned OHDSI Eden, the study-a-thon, so Erasmus and Oxford, a 5-day event to with 30 researchers resulting in 2 papers. Thank you to Case Western Reserve for sponsoring the OHDSI face-to-face document-a-thon. Normally, we don't think of documentation as the thing that draws people to a meeting, you know, come and pay your airfare to this meeting and then you can sit for 3 days and document. It was great fun, a great success. And, you know, and they just set Case Western set an example for how to do this, so that was nice. OHDSI China Symposium 2019 was a big success also, and this is now an annual symposium, and it worked out very well. Similarly, in Europe, OHDSI Europe 2019 took place at Erasmus. Had 250 participants at their meeting from 27 different countries, so broad representation. It was a very fun meeting, as you can see from the faces of the presenters, and you can't quite see the participants, but it went very well and had some good success. OHDSI tutorials held at Fudan University, and in fact, all around the world, all throughout the year. And datathons like the OHDSI Korea Study Design Datathon that we had this year. Let me note our upcoming symposia. We have the OHDSI Korea Symposium coming December 12th through 14th. The 12th and 14th are in Korean. The middle day, the 13th, is in English, held at a ski resort. And the OHDSI European Symposium 2020 held in Oxford in March, and we're looking forward greatly to that one too. So as I mentioned, our theme is continuous evaluation. How do we know we're making progress on our journey? So I'm just going to say a couple more words before I close out and hand it over. OHDSI evaluates itself and publishes the results. Of all the initiatives, I mean, I believe that OHDSI is the one that does the most evaluation and is the most self-critical. When you evaluate yourself, you make yourself open to criticism because you publish the truth. If you publish the truth, you're going to show what's going well and the imperfections. If you don't evaluate yourself, then you have plausible deniability that you have any faults. But we don't do that. We go ahead, just push ahead and do it. So for example, in the OHDSI CDM evaluation paper, we showed that the automated translation of your database from one vocabulary to another, that part can be automated using our mappings. And we get cohorts that have errors on the order of 0.23%, or that is 0.0023 portion of the time. If you look at the errors that come into creating cohorts, that is way smaller than anything else that comes up. So it's basically insignificant error. The caveat is that when you have a phenotype or a cohort definition, you cannot just automatically translate that it works best if you manually review the code. You can start with an automatic translation, but you really need to review it and make sure that you've done a good job capturing those terms. It's successful because when we're converting 2.7 billion patient records, you want that to be automated. When you're converting a smaller number of phenotype definitions, you can afford to manually review it. Emerge phenotype implementation. Well, first thing we showed is without a common data model, if you have phenotype or cohort definitions and you have a narrative description and a flow chart and pseudocode and concept sets, you end up with extreme heterogeneity as each site tries to implement those instructions. You would think that that would be enough to get there, but it isn't enough. And with a common data model, we can improve the consistency and efficiency. Yet there too, there were caveats, and we had inconsistency even using the common data model. So again, showing our imperfections and then working hard to improve. And last, phenotype evaluation. One of the bottlenecks in creating phenotypes is evaluating, because you got to sit there and review 100 or 1,000 cases manually and say which ones have the phenotype or not. How can we automate that? Phevaluator does exactly that and estimates the performance based on a kind of a mock gold standard. But the estimates are imperfect, and they're represented in that paper. So each step we make progress, we admit where we've made mistakes, and we work further to improve. Today's particular focus is how do we know we're making progress towards real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. So the focus this morning on, so we're doing evaluation across the board, we're looking at regulatory decision-making. I'm just gonna, this is the agenda, which you don't need to read. It's in your books. This morning we're gonna have a plenary followed by a stakeholder panel. Then we're gonna do at noon, or just before noon, our collaborator showcase. That's where we'll be serving lunch. We'll come back in for a lightning talks, which are always very fun. Then back to the collaborator showcase. And then the afternoon, back to the community, and that's where we have a series of talks related to that. It reminds me that last night, some of you were at the Women of OHDSI event, the forum that was held. It was really a spectacular event. It went way better than I mean, just thank you to Maura Beaton for having the idea of pulling this thing forward, and all the people who worked on that, and our the women leaders who came in to talk about leadership. And I think we'll be remembering that one for years. We have our closing session, led by Patrick Ryan, and then our networking reception, which I hope you stay for from 5:30 to 7:30. Soon I'll be turning it over to my colleague, Harlan Krumholz from Yale, who will be introducing the plenary and talking about regulatory decision-making. I'll now close this session by introducing myself, George Hripcsak from Columbia, which I realized after introducing Harlan I never did. And I hope to introduce each of you in future plenaries, giving talks as we go on each year to bring more of the community to this side of the microphone. And we're trying to do that this year, as you'll see, and we'll continue to do more of it. Let me now hand it over to Harlan.
Thanks, George. It's gosh, it's such a pleasure to be here. You know, I think about this group, like you guys are all pioneers. I mean, you know, I sort of think it's like lots of people are talking about big data and talking about insights, but then they're the mechanics of it. You know, how do you actually make it work? And how do we bring together the data that's out there and do the kind of research that's needed? And you know, at most of the major medical meetings, now on the clinical application side, you know, I don't think they have any idea about what it is that you're doing. And yet you're laying the groundwork and the foundation for what I think will be the next era of knowledge generation that will exist within medicine and throughout healthcare. And kudos to the team that's helping to coordinate this. They're a humble group, and really donating so much of their time to the notion of what the future is going to look like. And kudos to each of you to come together like this. It's a diverse group from across the world who are motivated by the idea that research is going to be different in the future than it's been in the past. And I heard this sort of description one time about the need for us to move from where we are to where we're going to go. It's sort of research has been a hunter-gatherer, sort of activity for a long time. You have a question, you go out and figure out the data, whether you have to collect it or you can leverage it, and you build up whatever you need to build to answer that question, and then it sort of got to start over again for the next question. And moving it into an era of industrial farming, where we've got the infrastructure, we've got the pipelines, we're able to ask the questions, and we can do it with the kind of speed and agility that's necessary in this world. But I am just so extraordinarily amazed to see this community come together and sort of help build those roads and to help build that infrastructure. And just looking at the posters that were up here, there's a modest number of posters, but each one of them I was just really impressed with and thought, it's not just a singular poster. Almost every one of them has a message for work that can follow it. It's building up ideas, whether it's a specific research question or whether it's a methodologic approach. But I see each one not as singular, but I see each one as being the beginning of many derivative pieces of work that can build on top of it. They're all generative in that way. So I see them not isolated and sequestered, but a small number of posters that have the potential for outsized impact. And I don't think we should lose that sense. So I put together some ideas. I had written this piece a couple years ago, in 2014. Unfortunately, it's still true, but it's a major motivator that the current medical research enterprise cannot keep pace with the information needs of patients, clinicians, administrators, and policymakers. The flow of new knowledge is too slow and its scope is too narrow. And, in my field, I'm a cardiologist. I can tell you that, we'll spend a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars doing a single experiment that provides an average result that then gets codified into guidelines and takes another decade to get into practice. I mean, there's no other group, no other service that would seek to take that long to figure out what's going on. I mean, in a world where Amazon's learning from every click and Google from every search and Tesla from every mile, in medicine we are far too slow and our scope is far too narrow. And to get to a precision medicine era where we understand the heterogeneity, we know there's immense heterogeneity. Our trials are powered for the single experiment. They're underpowered for every single subgroup that you might want to do subsequently. It leads us to treat many non-responders. It leads companies to give up on products that could be helpful for a small group of people. It leads companies to be, without knowledge, treating many people who actually don't benefit. And literally, we can't stand still in that construct. I say the medical research community's delay in adopting big data approaches has left it particularly ill-prepared for a precision medicine future that's designed to provide personalized information and individualized care. I mean, this to me still is the call to action. And that medicine aspires to a learning health system, but it's failing to rapidly learn from the data being generated through the everyday course of care. Within medicine, we develop this approach where we sequester knowledge. We don't share it. We don't create a collective wisdom. You've got to have gray hair and a long practice in order to have experience, and that experience through the lens of your cognitive biases is often incorrect anyway. And so you get good at pattern recognition, but whether you can piece together causal inference is likely not not really possible, except in the cases where the cause is so clear. You take you take high doses of amiodarone for years, you turn blue, that's probably the cause. But for most of the effect sizes that we're interested in, we're unable to perceive them. And so we're left ignorant, even after years and years of practice. And our own experience is unable to be coalesced in any meaningful way with the experience of all of our colleagues. And then I look at this and I think, like, we can create a collective wisdom, a power to create a collective wisdom across the world. And we can leverage the kind of experiments that are going on across the world because we have pockets of habits and propensities to do things and uncertainties about what the right thing to do is. So we have many experiments going on because different people are doing different things. That may be across countries. It is within practices. And we can leverage what we've been railing against for a long time, which is medicine's highly variable in its application, in the decision making. If you come in the morning, you might get a different treatment than if you come in the afternoon, or Monday on Wednesday, or in every different person. And that problem, at least in the short run, may provide the opportunity. So, I think that what's really good what I've seen in the U.S. and with the FDA is that there's a growing appetite for this. I mean, the recognition of the problem is just the start. But that has to spread because people have to begin to say that the status quo is not good enough. Because for us to get people to change and think about things differently, for us to get journals to open their minds, and for us to get our colleagues and people on the front lines to be able to think differently about the evidence that's generated and the bounds of uncertainty. Look, we're not saying that it's always great to run an experiment. Randomization is a powerful approach, but sometimes you just can't do it. And sometimes you need to complement it. And sometimes you need to think about the advantages of actually looking at what's going on in the real world. So, I think this is from an article that was published in 2017 that was led by Rachel Sherman, at that time the deputy director of the FDA. That's the highest non-political position within the FDA. Amy Abernathy holds that position now, another great advocate for the use of real-world data. With her experience at Duke and at Flatiron. Now she's also another remarkable leader. And in this article, they say growing access to diverse real-world data sources is enabling new approaches to close persistent evidence gaps about the optimal use of medical products in real-world practice. Gosh, she must be talking about you. I mean, this is directly applicable to everybody in this room and the kind of work that everyone's doing. Within this paper, she said, here we argue that contrary to widespread impressions, existing FDA regulations embody sufficient flexibility to accommodate the emerging tools and methods needed to achieve these goals. Emerging tools and methods, she's talking about you. She's saying that the FDA is ready to listen. By the way, you heard, FDA is in large part sponsoring this conference. Now, I will say not everyone at the FDA is bought in on the approach that's being taken. In part, that's a design issue. That's not about where the data is coming from. It's about the designs and whether we're mitigating bias, whether we can understand confounding appropriately, what are our approaches. But for a long time at the agency, only randomization was felt to be, now with 21st Century Cures Act and emerging Rob Califf, introduction of a lot of ideas at the FDA, there's a very different feel. This is an article that Rob first authored, but the important thing about this New England Journal article, Transforming Evidence Generation to Support Health and Healthcare Decisions, was that the author list was a who's who of leadership for health and healthcare throughout the federal agencies. So this was not only a piece by the then commissioner of the FDA, but he was able to bring on board people from across the federal agencies in a common voice saying we need to be looking for different ways of doing things. And they acknowledged that there was this congressional mandate. So by law in the U.S. requires the coordination of relevant federal health programs to build data capacity for comparative clinical effectiveness research from multiple sources, including electronic health records. Congress could have been talking about you. When they say the federal government needs this, I think they need what you're doing, what this is building, the capacity that this is going to provide, the benefits that the work that you're doing is going to allow for the country and the world. And again, you guys are building the roads. You guys are enabling the structures. You're building the infrastructure for which much will come. It's one thing, Congress, this is important, is saying we need you to look in this direction. But it's up to us to make sure, one, it's possible with the data, and then the designs are set to minimize bias, right? And to have us understand uncertainty. So when I look to this community, I think like, wow, such a vast reservoir of immensely talented people across a broad spectrum of disciplines coming together in the recognition that the only way to build this infrastructure is to work together. Because there's so many facets to it. There's so many facets. You can't just say, yeah, let's just put it up. The common data model is a facet. The vocabularies are a facet. The concepts are a facet. How we bring this together and cooperate and coordinate. The values of this group, of sharing. But then on the epidemiologic side, the methods side, the design side, the minimizing of the bias side, and the understanding of uncertainty side. All of this requires expertise that does not reside in a single community or person, but only in a multidisciplinary community like this that stretches across and works together, willing to hold hands and work together for common good. He's further said in this piece, government agencies and partners in the private sector, including those who fund research, are now collaborating on the focused development of infrastructure for the generation of evidence that can support a learning health system. That's you again. The learning healthcare system is the idea that each patient coming through teaches us something so we're smarter for the next patient. So we're smarter for the next person. I mean, no one wants to suffer in vain to know their own experience didn't help the next person facing the similar challenge, and also that they were helped by those who came before them. It's the ultimate pay it forward. It's the ultimate ethos to say, what I've gone through should make a difference to the next person behind me. And it shouldn't be a decade later. The faster we can ensure that these models are updating, that we're learning in real time, that papers are not static output, but that there's the means by which we can be checking over time. Like I said, the newness of this is the streaming nature. The database is different today than it was yesterday. You know, you do a Google search and you do it 5 minutes later, it's a different search. You know that same words, but it's like Google updates the search based on everything that happened in that 5 minutes. Like, gosh, if only medicine were important enough for us to spend the time to make sure that happened in medicine. If only the consequences were important enough, like to people's lives, that we would invest so we could do that too. So when I see the patient next, actually everything's updated. I mean, and it'll be in imperceptible ways, just like you do Google search. Often it's imperceptible to you that the algorithm has updated. But for us, same thing. When I'm telling a patient in front of me what the risk of surgery is versus medical therapy, or we're making decisions and looking at options. I mean, wouldn't it be great if what I was doing in this moment was different than if I'd done it an hour ago? And by the way, I can also have the means to communicate back if any major insight was gleaned that might affect people who've already made decisions. We can reach back and say, there's a different insight here that might be important to you. I mean, this is what we want to achieve. This is what you're doing. This is what you're enabling. I mean, again, we are at the very beginning of this, very beginning. There's another piece that was written by FDA that was in JAMA as an opinion piece, a viewpoint. says if real-world data and real-world evidence are to be effectively leveraged for public health purposes, there will need to be shared learning and collaboration across clinicians, patients, healthcare systems, pharmaceutical companies, and regulators. They're talking about you. I mean, like what she's envisioning, what they're envisioning, is what you've created. And it's a recognition and acknowledgement that this can only occur by this sort of massive collaboration, people getting together, and pioneers like you who've taken the time to come here and make this happen. So what do I love about Odyssey? I want to spend a few minutes just saying, what do I love about it? Like, why was I drawn to this group? Well, you know, I immediately recognized the brilliance. And I don't say this lightly, but, you know, just looking at the posters, you can see this. You look at what's coming out of Odyssey, you see what's being posted. I mean, this isn't intended to pander to the audience, but I really think it's a brilliant group of people. And I'd had exposure to Patrick Ryan. Patrick's inspiring to me, the approach that he takes to research and the way that he's taken this on. But you know, like, so it's fun to be around people who are thinking deeply about the future. They're not just accepting the status quo, but they're trying to stretch to figure out what's next. How can we work together? Where's that going to be? But this is what I will tell you. Like, there are a lot of brilliant people in the world, but this community is built on a spirit of collaboration and kindness and generosity. And that's what I will say primarily drew me, because I saw, like, these are people who are coming here outside of their own disciplines to work together collaboratively, and often without due credit. Because when you're building the initial roads, it can be thankless work in the sense that the world hasn't yet recognized what's coming down the pike. And when you talk to friends and colleagues about it, they still don't quite get the power of what's being created here. You still are very early adopters. And early adopters are in a position where there's not necessarily widespread appreciation for what's being done yet. I predict very soon this is going to become mainstreamed. I mean, like I said, I go to American Heart Association meeting. This is not going to be on the schedule, I'll tell you right now. But it's weird. I mean, it's like I was saying before, it's like someone's invented the microscope, and in most of the scientific meetings are saying, you know, I just prefer to look at it with my eyes. You know, I mean, I'll do it the old way. You know, that just seems like more convenient. And part of it is because there's a lot to learn. So we've got to decide how we reach different audiences, because they're not all going to become expert at all of this. And it's a differentiation. Like I said, there's a differentiation on the data, and there's a spirit differentiation on the design. But like I said, what you guys are doing, and the reason I say collaboration, kindness, generosity, the openness, the willing to share, the willing to be vulnerable. I mean, ultimately, George, sharing is about vulnerability, right? It's saying we are not perfect. And we know our advances are based on what others have done. So can we accelerate this process? One, if there is a mistake, if there's something wrong, let's learn. Let's find out. Let's not chastise or scold or embarrass. Let's say, great, let's correct. Let's move forward. And let's make sure that the next person starting at a starting point that's beyond where everyone else shouldn't have to go back to the starting line. There's enough to do. And then I do believe we have to find ways increasingly to credit, you know, the provenance of the code, the provenance of people's contributions. We have to do this if you're in academic institutions for promotions, if you're in companies to be able to, your annual reports. I mean, we need to find ways to make sure that the important contributions you're all making are understood locally so you get the support you need. But this generosity, kindness, and collaborations was key. What else? Well, it is this principles of transparency and open science and integrity. It is this idea that we're learning together, and that in order to adequately learn, we need to expose, we need to share, we need to help each other. We need to take pride in each other's achievements, and we need not have the typical academic mentality of sequestering all my stuff for me and then being able to work on it because it was all about me, it was my study, no one else is going to see it. Most people who are ill want as many smart people as possible working on their problem to make as fast a progress as they can, to help them if they can, or help others behind them at least. And in order for that to happen, our whole drive should be speed. Speed. And that speed is only possible if we share. If we share, help each other, learn from each other, and create the insights that make us better. And then, this is, I said the brilliance, but the other thing I love, and I sort of put these, like I said, the compassion, generosity, kindness is like I put that at the top. And then the sharing, which is very important to me, also the open science mentality, I put that second, but that's very important. And this one's, I would say, neck and neck with all of those. But it's a scientific rigor, the commitment to reproducibility and exploring the validity of the work. We will be undermined if we don't set an example. People in this room who I know are early adopters, that there are standards with regard that we need to follow and methods we need to continue to evolve that continue to help us make proper inferences from the data that we have. And so this is why, again, I love this community. There's a commitment. This isn't just about data. Actually, this community is about action. Wants to see, as George put up the 3 levels, like the final level was clinical application. But so we want to be confident in this. We'll never be completely sure. By the way, you do an experiment. People do a single experiment, and they say they think they know the answer. A single large experiment, a clinical trial, doesn't necessarily tell you the answer either, particularly for all subgroups, particularly in all venues, particularly for the potential heterogeneity that will exist. So this group, by sort of saying this is part of who you are, is to do things really well, to care about the details, to care about the science, and to be able to demonstrate it in the way that actually few of us have been able to live up to in the past with regard to observational research, meaning that if you do a single observational study, that might represent one of the dots of many dots that could have been done with various assumptions, and that our commitment to try to understand that better is different. And so, I think that's also why I love this group. So here are the key challenges I just want to highlight. I think the issues of data quality remain critically important. No data is important. No data is perfect. Even data that is carefully collected in highly structured clinical trials. I mean, we have to get away from this idea that there's ever perfect data, but the data that's coming in from all these different sources, may be of different quality. It's something to take into account. And it's also a common point of criticism that the data is not regulatory grade, it's not clinical grade. Well, we need to explore and expose the assumptions underneath that. And we need to figure out what do we do to make the data better. And I saw there's a poster that even talks about gender mismatches within a single record and so forth. So there's going to be ways that we try to make this better, but we also have to understand where it limits us, where it matters, where it doesn't matter, and how we manage it. Data spectrum, I think we need to be thinking also, we've got existing data that's generated in the everyday operation of healthcare. I think increasingly we're going to have patient-generated data and patient-reported data. I hope that we'll get to the point where that's all going to be coming together, organized, harmonized, being able to put into OMOP and shared. We need to be able to be stretching ourselves to include the patient perspective in ways that don't exist within most of repositories now. So, we have to think about that. The causal inference issue is a vulnerability. Sometimes you send these papers to journals and they just knee-jerk reaction say, well, this isn't an RCT. I don't know. It's baffling because they publish a lot of observational studies that are about causal inference, but then they also erratically kind of will not take some that look like they could be very consequential. Maybe it's like, we'll take a bunch that don't seem consequential, but then this one seems consequential and, worried about it. I don't know. Or the vast numbers that we use scare the journals because they think there's no way you could be doing rigorous research with so many participants. But anyway, we've got to think ourselves about strengthening this, defending it, being able to understand the limits of what the research that we do as well as the possibilities. Communication education, like I said, we need to proselytize. We need to be able to get out and help people understand better what this new world is going to look like, what the possibilities are, what the challenges are, what we can infer, what we can't, and how to go forth, and what people need to learn who want to join you so that this conference, your community becomes ever larger. And it's already, as George showed, I mean, spreading across the world, but I think we're still at the very, very beginning. And then application, you know, when something ready for clinical, it will depend a little bit on the consequence of the question and the alternative sources of information and where we stand with regard to knowledge. But this is something we should be debating vigorously as to how this goes into application. So in the next plenary, what you'll see is some focus on data quality in the first plenary, analytic standards in the second plenary, evidence quality in the third plenary. But I hope the day will be replete with conversations about both whatever you're doing, the excitement you have, the ability to link with others, as well as the notion of what this future is going to look like and how we overcome some of these key challenges. And then really how you participate, importantly, in continuing to build this infrastructure, this culture, and this immense amount of productivity that's come out of a relatively small number of highly dedicated people who want to make the future better than the past. So with that, thank you very much, and hand back to George. We'll start the plenaries, or how we want to do it.